Welcome to Life Story 999, where inspiring tales of transformation come to life. In today's episode, we're sharing a story about an elderly veteran, a small-town diner, and the incredible act of unity that changed everything. Grab a cup of coffee and settle in as we explore how one moment of prejudice led to a powerful transformation. And remember, we'd love to hear your thoughts. What would you have done in this situation? Share in the comments below or email us your own stories of resilience. Tom Johnson, an 83-year-old black veteran, pushed open the door of Willow Creek Cafe on a bright Sunday morning. His hands, worn and marked with years of labor and service, reflected a lifetime of dedication to his country. Tom only wanted one thing, a peaceful breakfast in the cozy town of Brookside. As he walked in, he was greeted by the welcoming ring of a small bell, signaling his arrival. Tom spotted an empty booth by the window and made his way there, his military jacket adorned with faded medals, symbols of courage and sacrifice. He settled into his seat, unaware that this morning would be anything but ordinary. From behind the counter, the cafe owner, Greg Thompson, eyed Tom with disapproval. Greg had never hidden his distaste for people different from himself, and today was no exception. Despite Tom's dignified appearance, Greg's gaze hardened as he watched the elderly veteran sit by the window. The medals that should have stirred admiration in Greg seemed instead to provoke resentment. In a far corner of the cafe, a small group of motorcyclists sat chatting softly. Their rugged looks contrasted with the quaint cafe setting, but beneath their tough exteriors, these men were quietly observant. As they noticed the shift in Greg's demeanor when he looked at Tom, they exchanged glances, sensing trouble. A waitress named Nancy approached Tom's table with a warm smile. "Good morning, sir," she greeted kindly as she poured him a fresh cup of coffee. Tom smiled back, grateful for her kindness, feeling at ease for a moment, until Greg began moving toward his table, his face a mask of hostility. The motorcyclists watched, their casual demeanor fading as they saw Greg approach with obvious intent. What began as a quiet breakfast was about to turn into something much more significant, a moment that would shape how this town saw itself and how strangers would become allies. Greg stopped at Tom's table, his eyes cold and his voice harsh. "We're full today," he said curtly, though there were clearly several empty booths around. Tom looked up, confused but calm, and replied, "It seems like there are quite a few seats available." Greg's expression darkened, his jaw tightening. "I said we're full," he repeated, louder this time, drawing the attention of other patrons. "We reserve the right to refuse service to anyone." The room grew quiet as eyes turned toward the confrontation. Tom took a deep breath, the sting of the rejection evident but familiar. He had faced this kind of prejudice before. Just as Tom began to rise from his seat, a deep voice interrupted the silence. "Is there a problem here?" It was one of the motorcyclists, a tall man with a silver beard named Frank. His tone was calm, but there was an unmistakable authority behind his words. Greg hesitated, his earlier confidence faltering. "This is my diner. I decide who stays and who goes," he stammered, but his voice lacked its former edge. Frank nodded slowly. "That may be so," he said, "but this man served our country. He deserves respect, just like anyone else in here." Behind Frank, the rest of the motorcyclists stood up, their jackets revealing military insignias. They were veterans too, and they understood the meaning of sacrifice and camaraderie. The tension in the diner was palpable. Greg's gaze flickered nervously from Frank to the other bikers, then to the rest of the patrons, who were all watching closely. His authority, once taken for granted, was now slipping away. "You need to leave," Greg repeated, but his voice trembled, lacking conviction. Frank shook his head. "No," he said firmly. "We're not leaving until you treat this man with the respect he's earned." The other motorcyclists nodded in agreement, their solidarity evident. Greg looked around, hoping for support from the other customers, but found none. Even Nancy, the waitress, stood by the counter, her face pale and her notepad clutched tightly to her chest. The room had grown silent, and it was clear to everyone present that Greg was losing control. Tom looked at Frank, gratitude in his eyes. He had come here for a simple meal, and now he found himself surrounded by unexpected allies. He gave Frank a gentle nod and spoke softly, "Thank you, but I think it's best if I leave." He didn't want to escalate things further. Frank nodded back, respect in his eyes. "We'll walk out with you," he said. Together, Tom and the bikers made their way to the door, leaving behind a diner filled with people who had witnessed a powerful stand for justice. Before they left, Frank turned to Greg. "You should think about what kind of place you want this to be," he said quietly, "because we're not done here." With that, they stepped out into the morning sun, a sense of purpose binding them together. Later that day, Frank and the bikers gathered at a local park to discuss what had happened. The confrontation at the diner was still fresh in their minds, and they knew they couldn't let it end there. Frank spoke up, his voice steady. "We need to make sure Greg understands that this kind of behavior has no place in our town. We can't let this slide." The others nodded in agreement. They talked about their options, how they could peacefully show their support for Tom and make a statement. After some discussion, they decided that a protest was the best way to send a message. They would return to the diner the next day, not to cause trouble, but to stand together as veterans and community members who believed in respect and equality. Tom, who had been invited to join their discussion, listened quietly. He appreciated their support but worried about escalating the situation. Frank reassured him, "We're not here to fight, Tom. We're here to show that our community stands together against hate." Tom nodded, moved by their commitment, and agreed to join them the next day. The next morning, Tom decided to take a walk into town. He was curious to see if anything had changed after the events of the previous day. As he approached Willow Creek Cafe, he was surprised to see a crowd gathered out front. Dozens of motorcycles were parked along the street, their owners standing silently, forming a barrier in front of the entrance. It was Frank and his group, along with more veterans who had joined them. The sight was both peaceful and powerful, a silent protest against the injustice Tom had faced. The veterans stood in unity, their jackets adorned with military patches, a testament to their shared history and their commitment to one another. Greg emerged from the diner, his face flushed with anger. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice echoing across the street. Frank stepped forward, his expression calm. "We're here to make a statement. No violence, no threats. Just a reminder that respect is earned." Greg fumed, pointing a shaking finger at the group. "You can't do this. I'll call the police." Frank shrugged. "Go ahead," he replied evenly. "We're not breaking any laws. We're standing here peacefully, supporting a fellow veteran." Within minutes, the sound of sirens approached, and 2 patrol cars pulled up. The officers stepped out, surveying the scene. One of them, a man with graying hair, approached Frank. "What's going on here?" he asked. Frank explained the situation, his voice steady and respectful. The officer listened, then turned to Tom. "Mr. Johnson," he said, "is it true you were refused service here yesterday?" Tom nodded. "Yes," he said, his voice unwavering. "I was refused service because of the color of my skin." The officer's expression hardened slightly as he turned back to Greg. "As long as they remain peaceful, they have the right to be here," he said firmly. Greg's face reddened further, and he stormed back inside, slamming the door behind him. As the hours passed, more people gathered. Neighbors came to show their support, and news vans arrived to cover the story. What had begun as a quiet protest had grown into a community movement, a stand against discrimination. The protest continued throughout the day, with more and more people joining in. Families, friends, and neighbors stood together, holding signs that read respect for all and no place for hate. The atmosphere was one of unity, a collective desire for change. Nancy, the young waitress, eventually made her way through the crowd to where Tom was standing. Her eyes were red, and she looked both nervous and determined. "Mr. Johnson," she began, her voice trembling, "I'm so sorry for what happened. I should have said something yesterday, but I was scared." Tom looked at her, his expression softening. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Thank you, Nancy," he said kindly. "It takes courage to come here today. We all have things we're afraid of, but standing up now, that means a lot." Nancy nodded, tears welling in her eyes. She gave Tom a small, grateful smile before stepping back into the crowd. The hours passed, and the protest only grew stronger. People lit candles as the sun began to set, holding them high as symbols of hope. The flickering flames cast a warm glow over the crowd, a soft light in the gathering dusk. Tom stood among them, a candle in his hand, the warmth of it seeping into his skin. Frank stood beside him, his own candle held aloft. "This is just the beginning," he said quietly. Tom nodded, his heart full. "Yes," he replied, "just the beginning." In the weeks that followed, Willow Creek Cafe's business plummeted. The sight of the bikers and the coverage on local news had brought unwanted attention to Greg's discriminatory behavior. Customers stopped coming, and the once busy diner was now nearly empty. Greg could often be seen through the windows, his expression weary and defeated. One afternoon, Frank approached Tom with an idea. "We're thinking of making Greg an offer to buy the diner," he said. "Turn it into a place that stands for what this town should be, inclusive and welcoming." Tom's eyes widened slightly at the suggestion, but he could see the potential in Frank's vision. A few days later, Frank and a small group of veterans walked into the empty diner. Greg looked up from behind the counter, his eyes widening as he saw them. Frank placed an offer letter on the table. "We're offering to buy the diner at a fair price," he said calmly. "You have a chance to walk away and let something better take its place." Greg hesitated, his hands trembling slightly as he picked up the letter. For a long moment, he seemed to be grappling with his pride, the reality of his situation sinking in. Finally, he let out a shaky breath, picked up a pen, and signed his name. Tom watched as the transaction unfolded. It felt like the closing of one chapter and the beginning of a new one. Willow Creek Cafe, once a symbol of exclusion, would now become a beacon of hope and unity. Over the next several weeks, renovations began. The old sign was taken down and replaced with a new one that read Unity Cafe. The transformation of the diner was not just physical but symbolic. The interior was revamped, with new decorations celebrating the diversity of the community and honoring the veterans who had served. The grand reopening of Unity Cafe was a community event. People from all over Brookside came to see the changes and be part of the new beginning. The atmosphere was electric with hope and excitement. The smell of freshly brewed coffee and warm pastries filled the air, and the sound of laughter and conversation created a comforting symphony. Tom was the guest of honor that day, the first customer to step through the doors of the newly transformed cafe. Frank greeted him at the entrance, a broad smile on his face. "Come on in, Tom," he said, leading him to a booth by the window. Tom looked around, his eyes taking in the bright, welcoming space. He saw Nancy, now working comfortably, her face lit up with a genuine smile as she served customers. Frank slid into the booth across from Tom. "What do you think?" he asked, a hint of nervousness in his voice. Tom took a moment before answering, his gaze sweeping across the room. He saw families of different backgrounds sharing meals, children laughing, people chatting, a true representation of the community he had always hoped to see. "It's perfect," Tom said, his voice filled with emotion. "You made something beautiful out of something so painful." Frank's face broke into a relieved smile, and he nodded. "That's what we wanted, to turn this place into something that brings people together." As the day went on, Unity Cafe continued to fill with people. Tom watched as Frank moved around the room, greeting patrons and making sure everyone felt welcome. It was clear that Frank and his friends had poured their hearts into this place, and the community had responded. Later, as the sun began to set, Frank joined Tom at his booth once more. The cafe was still buzzing with activity, but there was a sense of calm that had settled over the room. Frank looked out the window, watching the golden light filter through the glass. "You know," he said quietly, "when we first decided to do this, I wasn't sure if it would work. I wasn't sure if people would want to come back." Tom smiled, a knowing look in his eyes. "Change is hard," he said, "but when people see that it's for the better, they'll come around. You've given them a place to belong, Frank. That's something special." Frank turned to look at Tom, his expression thoughtful. "We did this together," he said. "All of us, you, me, everyone who showed up that day. We made this happen." Tom nodded, his heart swelling with pride. "And it's just the beginning," he said, echoing the words Frank had spoken at the protest. "This place is going to mean something to people. It's going to remind them that change is possible, even when it feels like the world is against you. Frank reached across the table, clasping Tom's hand in a firm handshake. To new beginnings, he said, his voice full of emotion. Tom returned the handshake, a smile spreading across his face. To new beginnings, he repeated. The Unity Cafe quickly became more than just a place to grab a meal. It was a symbol of resilience, of the power of community, and of the belief that change was always within reach. People from all walks of life gathered there. Families, veterans, young people, and elders. It became a space where everyone felt welcome, where everyone belonged. One afternoon, as Tom sat by the window, he watched a young boy approach an elderly couple at a nearby table. The child struck up a conversation, his eyes bright with curiosity, and the couple's faces lit up with joy. It was a small moment, but it represented something much larger. The breaking down of barriers, a glimpse of a future where kindness prevailed over prejudice. Frank returned to Tom's side, gesturing toward the bustling cafe. "This is what it's all about," he said softly, his voice filled with pride. Tom looked at Frank, then back at the lively scene unfolding before them. People of all backgrounds were gathered, sharing stories, meals, and laughter. It was a true reflection of what the community could be when people chose compassion over division. Tom nodded, his heart full. He turned his gaze back to Frank. "To unexpected friendships, to second chances, and to new beginnings," he said, raising his coffee mug in a toast. Frank smiled, lifting his own mug to meet Tom's. "To a future where everyone feels welcome," he added. Their mugs clinked together, the sound resonating with a sense of hope and unity. It wasn't just about a diner. It was about a community coming together, about standing up for what was right, and about creating a space where everyone belonged. The Unity Cafe had become a symbol of that ideal, a place where people could gather without fear of being judged or turned away. As Tom took a sip of his coffee, he felt a profound sense of hope wash over him. He knew that change wasn't always easy, and it wasn't always fast. But it was moments like this, small acts of kindness, people standing up for one another, that paved the way for something better. Tom realized that they had accomplished something truly special, and though there was still work to be done, he knew they were on the right path. Frank looked around the cafe, his eyes softening as he watched the joyful interactions taking place. "We did good, Tom," he said quietly, his voice filled with emotion. Tom smiled, his eyes glistening. "We did," he agreed. "And this is just the beginning." The Unity Cafe had become more than just a place to eat. It was a testament to resilience, unity, and the belief that change was possible. As Tom sat there, surrounded by friends, neighbors, and strangers who had become allies, he knew that Brookside was well on its way to becoming the kind of town he had always dreamed it could be, one where everyone truly felt welcome and valued. Thank you for joining us on this journey of resilience, unity, and change. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like the video, comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to Life Story 999 for more inspiring tales. Together, we can make a difference, one story at a time. What would you have done in this situation? Have you ever stood up for someone in need? Share your experiences in the comments or email us. We'd love to hear from you. Click here to watch another powerful story that we know you'll love.